Okay, anyway, my partner and I have decided that all of the works of William Shakespeare should be devoted to Edward de Vere instead. According to Richard Paul and Jane Rowe of Concordia University, the Queen directed that Edward be raised in the home of a man who owned the largest library in England. Which means that he would have a lot of knowledge in his writing. Unlike Edward de Vere, that there's no documents ever found that he ever went to school. According to Richard Paul and J. Edward de Vere was nurtured in the arts of poetry and stagecraft from his youth, and he was a very talented writer. We know church records of his birth and marriage and death. We know all legal records from where he lived in London. We know accounts by people at the time of his rising status as a poet and a dramatist. Edward de Vere had a nickname that was very similar to Shakespeare's. It was Spear Shaker, and due to his nickname came from the ability of both at his tournaments and his coat of arms that featured a lion with a spear. Not a single document was found that William Shakespeare was an author. Edward de Vere is recognized as a very talented poet and playwright. There are a lot of Edward de Vere's surviving letters that resemble Shakespeare's works. If William Shakespeare never went to school, how would he have known proper grammar? And a lot of the things that William Shakespeare wrote about, he would have had to experience or see, and there's no proof that he ever experienced or saw any of the things that he wrote about in his place. I am open for questions and points of clarification.
So our case was William Shakespeare. We believe there is enough evidence to support William Shakespeare being the author of the works based on his life and reflects in his plays and writings. Therefore, we stand and resolve the works of William Shakespeare should not be a tribute to Edward de Vere. One of our points was the plays and poems were written based on life events that Shakespeare would have experienced. In Sonnet 116, it talks about bad marriage. Shakespeare was gone a lot when he went to London, so his marriage would have suffered. The plays Julius Caesar, Antony, Cleopatra, Caranullus shows his love for Roman culture. He would have gained his love through books he read in school. The plague was around in his lifetime, and he would have seen death. He reflects on his death and place. Some examples are Titus Andronicus, Hamlet's father, Duke of Clarence, and Julius Caesar. How would a man well off like Edward de Vere know the suffrage and death of the common people? Hamlet was the name of his son, and soon after he died, the play Hamlet came out. The protector, symbolizing a father's figure, in the plays was named William. Our second point is about his schooling. The Merry Wives of Windsor reflects on some of his school days by mentioning a boy named William by taking an exam. He dropped out young, but many geniuses dropped out of school. For example, Thomas Edison, Benjamin Franklin, Mark Twain, and Charles Dickens. That Stratford records at pbs.org shows in Rise and Falls of William's dad, which explains that he did not drop out because he wasn't capable of school, and it was because his family could not afford it. Our third case is proof of his according to pbs.org. The court document held at the Public Records Office showed proof of John William's dad had a fine wolf dealing. Baptismal, registered to Stratford Church where William got baptized. This proved he lived in Stratford because the law there states must be baptized within 5 days of birth. The William Shakespeare marriage certificate records held that Worcester Cathedral authenticating his marriage to Anne Hathaway. The report on the murder of one of his queen's men appears on William Connell's coroner's report. His name appears on the plays and poems. William is known in history as the greatest writer and playwright of all time. His plays are known around the world and are still used in today. Why would someone like Edward de Vere not want credit for such great work? We have came to the conclusion that we had enough evidence to believe with no shadow of doubt that Shakespeare is the sole writer of works of Shakespeare. No credit should be allowed to Edward de Vere. The allegations against Shakespeare should stop. Plays and writings were based on his life and experience. He did go to school and drop out, but dropping out had no effects on writing, and we mentioned above. Disbelievers based on their beliefs on how they think the real author should be and have been liked. Is there any questions?
So disbelievers have came up with this ideal person that they think the writer should be like. Whether there's proof of William Shakespeare or not, they think that everything in his life doesn't add up to what this great person should be like. The first point that my opponents brought up was that he was raised by scholars. This is an example of the disbelievers coming up with this ideal person. They think that, how could this guy be so smart if his parents weren't? But he must have had intelligent parents because he is such this great person and knows all this stuff. But I don't think that your parents' intelligence or skill level measures yours. We see this all the time when children are the first to go to school, in their family the first to go to college, or we see where these smart, intelligent doctors have parents that are just the average person. You don't need to be raised by scholars and have great parents to be a wise individual. Another point they brought up was that he was a talented writer. Just because this guy is a talented writer doesn't mean that Shakespeare wasn't. He doesn't, just because he was talented and knew all this stuff doesn't mean that he's the one that wrote it. There's many talented people and we don't call them all Shakespeare. And they mentioned that Shakespeare dropped out of school, but many people have dropped out of school that are great writers like Charles Dickens and Mark Twain. So if we want to count them out for not going to school, then we're going to have to question all of the works that they have done as well and say, well, they didn't finish school, so they probably didn't write it either. Another argument they brought up was the proof of his life. In our argument a couple minutes ago, we talked about the proof on pbs.org of documents that they have found that he did live, and something I would like to bring up is why would you want to give this credit to somebody else? If you were the greatest writer known to man right now, why would you want somebody else to take credit for it? You figure that you would want to take credit for your writings.
My partner and I believe that the works of William Shakespeare should be accredited to Edward de Vere for the following reasons. There's no documentation or books or anything that William Shakespeare had. There's no documentations of his schooling or any other life events that indicate that he wrote the sonnets. And the first argument my opponent brought up was that his plays and poems are based on his life events. But there are no documentations in a long stretch of his life, so it's really hard to indicate that William Shakespeare wrote the works. The second argument was that he had schooling, but they did not find any books books or documentation that William Shakespeare had went to school. They brought up the PBS.org for proof that William Shakespeare is a person, but that's just proof that William Shakespeare is a person. And
For what Kari said that they had, just because they didn't have schooling doesn't mean he doesn't know how to write. You're going to need some type of schooling to know how to write, to know what makes sense, or the reason why maybe William Shakespeare, the reason why Edward de Vere might have not wanted to take credit for his works because he might not have wanted to be in the spotlight because of his spot in society. His parents might not have approved of it. Also, all of William Shakespeare's signatures did not match. How was he such a great writer if he couldn't even match his own signatures?
My opponent brought up the fact that there were no documents or anything, or no sonnets. And the Stratford records at the PBS shows that the rise of the false Williams. Dad explains that he did not drop out because he was capable of school. And the court documents held that public schools often show that proof of John, which is William's dad, had a final doing. Though his name appears on plays and poems, William is known in history as the greatest writers and players of all time. His plays are known around the world and are still used today. Why would Edward de Vere, why would he not take credit for his own work and not want such great credits and great works?
After hearing the arguments of our opponents, we still agree that Shakespeare is responsible for all of the works. We believe there's enough evidence to support him. And our case one was the plays and poems are written based on life experiences that Shakespeare would have been through. His plays and his love for Roman culture show in all of these. His experiences with the plague and death show up in some of these things. And one of the most interesting things is that Hamlet was the name of his son, and soon after he died, the play came out, and there was a man in this named William, and who is symbolizing the father figure, so to me that connects straight across. There is proof of his schooling that he did go. According to PBS.org, he might have dropped out, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a genius. Many people have dropped out and are still great writers. And the Stratford records from PBS show that his father was doing well and then not so well, which would explain why he wasn't allowed to go to school anymore. And there is court document proof of his baptismal records. There are marriage certificate that he got married to Anne Hathaway. There's a coroner report of him, and his name appears on the plays and poems, so that right there should be the greatest proof. And for our conclusion, we think there's enough evidence to believe with no doubt that Shakespeare wrote this, and there should be no credit allowed to Edward de Vere. These allegations against Shakespeare should stop. Plays and writings were based on his life, events, and experiences, and disbelievers base their belief on how they think the author should be like rather than who it was.
In conclusion to this argument, my partner and I agree that Edward de Vere was the true author for the following reasons. Because of his family's background, his schooling, his being recognized as a poet and a playwright with great talent, and his surviving letters resembled Shakespeare's work. With that, we believe credit should be given to Edward de Vere and not William Shakespeare.